Today my subject is based upon, well, actually begins upon a book called Cracking the Bible Codes by Jeffrey Santinover. Now, many of you may have seen the bestseller. It was on, first of all, it was on all the bestseller lists. Now it's turning up in the bargain bins at many bookstores, called The Bible Codes, which was by and large debunked and even rejected by the guy who came up with the primary programs that developed the Bible Codes, and thought that the book had made a lot of serious mistakes about the Bible Codes. The book by Jeffrey Santinover is, I think, a much better book in the sense that, and not that I'm necessarily endorsing his conclusions, but in the sense that it gives you an enormous amount of background into the idea of the Bible Codes, where they come from, the Jewish sages that originally began to come up with the ideas of them and pursued them and tried to establish them. Now, the idea behind the Bible Codes is that God dictated the Torah to Moses letter by letter. Now, you think about this. This is a different view of inspiration or of scriptural inerrancy from that even held by the Southern Baptists, who have a very conservative view of scriptural inspiration, and they look upon it as the Word of God. In this particular case, the Jews who believe this particular line of thought believe that God actually sat there and spoke the entire Torah, that is the Pentateuch, the entire first 5 books of the Old Testament to Moses, letter by letter. And as a consequence, you have a divinely ordained document. The sages, some of them believe that the universe was actually created from the letters of the Torah, and that everything that is described in the Torah in one of the other ways of the codes that are embedded in this document, and that everything that is or ever will be or ever has been is written in and encoded in the Torah. The scribes of ancient times were cautioned that they should be very careful in copying the Torah, because in changing one letter, they could destroy the entire universe. All that is, all that ever has been, and all that ever would be is encoded and embedded in the Torah. There's a belief out of this, and you'll find it described in great detail in, not I think in the Bible Codes, but also in Cracking the Bible Codes, that all the names, or most of the names of all the great sages of Jewish history are recorded and coded in the text, and their dates of birth are actually encoded nearby, not nearby is a very relative term, but nearby in the text. Now, just how detailed are the Bible Codes when we start talking about everything that ever has been and everything that ever will be, all the names of sages, and so how far does this thing go in foretelling the future in the Bible Codes? Well, the theory has it that you can find most of the Gulf War in the Bible Codes. Saddam Hussein is there, along with the date of the first Scud B attack on Israel. The date of that is there. Not only is that there, but the word Scud B is there. The name Schwarzkopf is there. And one guy who's looked at it even goes so far as to say he has found CNN and Peter Arnett in the Bible Codes. And there are more people who know right now, I think, could tell you who Peter Arnett is than could tell you who is right now the Ambassador of the United Nations for the United States, or maybe even the Secretary of State for the United Nations. Now, what is the importance, do you think, of the Bible Codes? Why all of a sudden now? Why are these books coming out? Why this obsession with codes in the Bible? Is it a proof of God? As some people seem to look at it and think, my, look at this. This absolutely puts the divine stamp on this book. And it is a proof of the Bible and a proof of God. And it's a very reassuring thing to many people that helps them to feel good about God. Are these things in there because of prophecy? There's a rumor, I don't know if it's been confirmed or not, that Israeli intelligence was actually examining Bible codes during the Gulf War because of these references, perhaps to Scud B, and all the things that were taking place there that somebody pointed out to them, and maybe trying to find some idea to be able to use the Bible codes in the course of the Gulf War. Now, you should understand that there is a fairly wide body of scholarship that disputes all of this. In fact, one scholar took a Hebrew translation of Moby Dick, programmed the whole thing up in a computer, ran all of the programs on it, and was able to find all kinds of Jewish sages and all kinds of historical references in Moby Dick, depending upon how you manipulate the text and work the codes of the text. What's the problem, or what are the problems with the Bible codes? And I will tell you a few today. The first one is the text. It's a major problem. Someone pointed out, I think my good friend Dean pointed out, that there are like 130 differences between the Karen text and the Stuttgart text of the Old Testament. Well, that's 129 differences too many for the Bible codes. Because once you start shoving letters one way or the other, all kinds of things start breaking down in the codes. Now, statistically, they've actually examined the Stuttgart text against the Karen text, and they have found that there is a major drop in the reliability of the codes, but that they are still there, that you still find them here and there in the course of the codes. Now, what you need to understand is that in the Karen and the Stuttgart text, that these are based upon no manuscripts that are older than the 9th to the 11th century. All the manuscripts fall in this narrow range. This is the Masoretic text that people talk about so much. It is one text of the Old Testament, or what we call the Old Testament, of the Hebrew text of the Bible. No manuscripts are older than that. Everybody knows, the Jewish sages acknowledge, that it is not perfect. The Karen text is the one that is in general use, that the Jewish Publication Society has used, and the Jews around the world use to this day, by and large, in their translations of the Old Testament. The Stuttgart text is a critical text where scholars have used critical methods and have taken all the oldest manuscripts they have examined all of the scribal errors that have been made in all of them, and have used the same style of work that they do in New Testament textual criticism to work their way back to what they feel is the accurate Masoretic text. And you have to kind of then decide, are these guys right, or is the Karen text right? And on what basis you would make that decision is rather hard to determine. The Bible codes seems to say, depending upon your methodology, that the Karen text has more codes in it than the Stuttgart text has, by a very small margin. And what that means, where that all leads to, is beyond my capacity to explain to you today. I'm just going to tell you what I know about the situation. So scholarly analysis has produced that text, and there are, between these two versions of the Masoretic text, only about 130 differences between them. Now, what's wrong with this picture? The first question I would have to ask is, why is it that we have no Hebrew texts from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries? There are none. There are no manuscripts, copies of manuscripts, that fall in that range. Whereas when it comes to the New Testament, there are thousands in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century of little bits and scraps and pieces and what have you, complete, as far as that's concerned, manuscripts of the New Testament, both in scraps, in full codices, in other ways. All those are there. And who knows, I know James Tabor thinks that if they can ever get to the caves around Pila, that they might very well find more Christian texts than anybody perhaps realized existed. It will be very interesting, and I sincerely hope that they are able to succeed in doing that. If any of you would like to know more about that, let me know. I'll try to put you in touch with the Foundation for Biblical Archaeology, which finances most of what Jim and the other fellows are doing, because they would certainly like to have new subscribers, and those new subscribers happen to be the people they keep aware of some of the new stuff that they are doing. And some of it is really very exciting, as a matter of fact. What really appears to be, and the evidence would indicate that it's true, that all alternate manuscripts were suppressed. They were certainly destroyed. Because in the development and transmission of the Masoretic text, once a manuscript became worn and old, it was destroyed. It was not kept. And so this is the reason why in that tradition those manuscripts do not exist. But something has happened along the way. New Testament scholars have long argued that the New Testament writers were not using a text that was based on the Masoretic text whenever they cited the Old Testament. They were using a different text. There is some difference of opinion as to whether they were quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament that dates back about 300 years before them, or whether they were using a Hebrew text that differed from that entirely. For the longest time, scholars didn't know. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of argument about what they may have been using, and the assumption was that it almost had to be the Septuagint because they knew of no other version to work with. And a great deal of assumptions were made about the fact that the Septuagint, in the areas where it differs from the Masoretic text in its meaning, that this was a result of translation or of some other thing. Well, now we know something we did not know 40 years ago. We know that there was a separate and distinct Hebrew text that was in use in the first century that was different from the Masoretic text. What is not all, too well understood among people, and I was really shocked because when I went to the conference in Austin a few weeks ago on the Dead Sea Scrolls, where Professor Charlesworth, Professor Tabor, and others made presentations. These are men, by the way, who have been to Qumran, who've had their hands in the dirt, who've been inside the caves, who can actually read those texts in their original languages. Charlesworth said at that conference, he said, everything we knew about first century Judaism 40 years ago has turned out to be wrong. Shocked me to the core. This is a scholar. This isn't just some wild-eyed fanatic somewhere. This is a scholar. A man who's devoted his life to the study of the languages and the text and has publications galore on the subject, and who has studied it all of his life, and Tabor as well. Tabor's specialty is first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, as he calls it, which is basically the Judaism of the temple at the time of Christ. And what they tell us is that what all the scholars thought about Judaism in the first century, 40 years ago, has turned out to be wrong. And what has turned out to be wrong is that sectarian Judaism of the first century was every bit as sectarian as Christianity is today. It was splintered, and there were splinters of the splinters. And there was a different textual tradition of the Old Testament at that time. Now you can all relax. Let your pinched expressions go easy. There is no significant difference in meaning between the Qumran texts of the Old Testament or the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. But what is interesting is that in those areas where the Septuagint differs from the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls tend to agree with the Septuagint. And what that suggests is that the Septuagint was made from a different text from the Masoretic text. Now, there are some implications in this that you're going to have to give some thought to. What I just did was light a fuse. That fuse is going to burn under your chair until you put it out. And if you don't put it out, it's liable to explode some of your most cherished assumptions about things you have heard, things you have read, and things you have believed. Because the Old Testament is absolutely reliable. But as far as being able to rely on it word by word, letter by letter, scholarship says, I'm sorry, it won't work because you have no way of knowing which text is right. Now, you can't find your way back to it. This is begging the question to come around and say, well, we got all these codes over here, that we have developed a method that we can pull these codes out. And these codes tell you that our text is better than the other text. I'm going to come back to that thought in a moment because that thought is very, very important. There is, however, beyond the question of the text, and the text is almost insurmountable for the idea of biblical codes. They attack it, what do they call it? Statistically is the way they try to go about attacking the thing, but it presents still problems. But there's another problem that I think in many ways is more severe than that. In order for the codes to be true as prophecies, in order for it to be true that everything that has ever been or ever will be is written in the codes, for all the names of all these sages down through the ages to be written in the codes, for the Gulf War to be written in the codes, you have got to accept a very low view of prophecy. You have got to accept a view, really what amounts to a superstitious view of prophecy and of the history of the world. And that view is, as someone once said, prophecy is history written in advance. I am here to tell you prophecy is not history written in advance. Let me give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. Everything that ever has been or ever will be is written in the Torah, they tell us. I am driving to work. And when I come down to an intersection on my way to work, if I wanted to go over to the bookstore to pick up a book, I would stop at this intersection and I would make a left turn. All right? If I stop and decide this morning on my way to work, before I go into the office, I want to run down to Barnes & Noble and I want to pick up this book on the Bible codes. So I wait at the left turn. The guy behind me also has to wait when I make this decision to go get the Bible codes. Now, I might have said, I'm not going to get it this morning, I'll get it after work. But I didn't. I said, I'm going to do it now. He is held up. I make a left turn. He goes ahead and arrives at the next intersection just in time on a green light to pull out in front of a semi-trailer that can't stop and is killed. He's wiped out. Every child he might have had will never exist. None of the grandchildren will ever exist. None of the great-grandchildren will ever exist. There's a whole tree of people out there that will never come into existence because I decided to buy my book this morning instead of this evening. Did I have the ability to make that choice? Or was that choice made for me when God dictated the Torah to Moses, letter by letter? That's what you have to deal with. Now, there are people who believe that. There are people who believe that all that is knowable, that all that is lined out there. And I don't know whether they believe that God is a time traveler, that He can travel forward in time and view all this and come back in time and tell us about it, or whether they believe that God wrote it all down in the first place so He doesn't have to travel through time. Either way, we are posed with a terrible conundrum. We are posed with the conundrum that whenever I come to the point of making a decision to steal or not to steal, that is written in the Torah, what I will decide. Don't you understand that? It has to be so. For if I steal and get thrown into jail, and in my time in prison, something there, happens that affects my life, all this is written in the Torah years ago. So it is written that I would steal. Therefore, I had no choice but to steal. Therefore, why would God hold me accountable for stealing? Now, that's not the only problem. In fact, that's not even the most serious problem. The most serious problem for this is the Jonah paradox. Now, take this, this is a term we may not have heard before because I think it's new with me. The Jonah paradox. The one I just gave you presents you with an equivalent of the time travel paradox. The time travel paradox is well known, has been fairly well discussed. It is this, that if I can travel back in time, then I go back in time and I happen to run into my father, and either deliberately or accidentally I kill my father. This could very easily have happened because when my father and I were out hunting once, I nearly killed him. I had a shotgun in my hand. I had not been properly trained. And I was swinging on a rabbit that was going by, and as I squeezed off the shot brushed my father's hunting jacket. I was that far from killing my father. I go back in time, and by accident, this time I do, that means I can never exist. And if I could never exist, then I could not go back in time to kill him. This is the time travel paradox. It's impossible. And common sense tells you it's impossible, but philosophers are prone to do this kind of thing and find this kind of paradox. Well, I'm not a philosopher. I can barely call myself a theologian. But I will tell you about the Jonah paradox. And the Jonah paradox is this. Here's a man that God calls. He says, I want you to get up and go to that great city Nineveh and prophesy there what I shall tell you to prophesy. And Jonah says, I ain't going to do it. And he heads off the other way. You all know that part of the story. In fact, we've told that part of the story over and over and over again, and I don't think near enough attention has been given to the rest of the story. The rest of the story takes place when Jonah gets back to Nineveh after God says, you will go, and goes walking into the city saying, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Now here's your problem. Was that a true statement or was it a lie? What was written in the codes in the Torah? That Nineveh would be destroyed or that Nineveh would not be destroyed? Hey, if the Torah codes can tell you that Schwarzkopf was going to be in Desert Storm, they can tell you whether Nineveh was going to be destroyed or whether Nineveh was not, right? That's not hard to figure. Okay, let's look at it two different ways. One, Nineveh was going to be destroyed. It's written there. Jonah is given the prophecy. Jonah goes wandering in the city and he makes this prophecy, and then all of a sudden it doesn't happen. Well, now I'll tell you this much. Jonah has reason to be mad. He's got plenty of reason to be upset because he was lied to. Just plain lied to. But on the other hand, if it was written originally that Jonah that they would not be destroyed, then what's the point in sending him there in the first place? Oh, excuse me, I got that. It's so that they would repent. But do you see the problem you're running into? Here is Jonah coming into the city with a prophecy saying, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And there is not one word of conditionality in that statement. He didn't say if they don't repent. He didn't say if they continue in their present route. He didn't say any of those things. There were no conditions expressed. But in Jeremiah 18, there is this beautiful little passage in there that I think is really what I would call the iron law of prophecy. It's in the 18th chapter. And the iron law of prophecy is this. God says, if I at any time pronounce against a nation and say that this nation is going to be punished for their sins, if that nation repents of their sins, I will repent of the evil that I was going to do to them. If at any time I prophesy good toward a people, if they turn from the good of their doings and do evil before me, I will repent of the good that I said I was going to do to them, and I will destroy them. That is the iron law of prophecy. And the short statement is, all prophecy is conditional. Do you know why? Because the purpose of telling man the future is to give a man a chance to change the future. And that is something that I think has never been well understood, never been adequately expressed in our traditions, because we have tended to follow a wrong model of prophecy and a wrong model of what God is doing. We have assumed it's all written out there, it's going to happen a certain way, and we have never had to face the contradictions in what we believe relative to prophecy. There are enormous problems with it. But the truth is, the only reason God has to tell you what's going to happen next week, next month, or next year is to give you a chance on the one hand, or two, so that you will know His hand is in it on the other. And He does it for both of those reasons. And if God tells you a prophecy to give you a chance to change it, then it is not written in the Torah codes. I'm going to pause and give you a moment to quietly think about that while I get a glass of water. Because what I have told you is one of the most important things you're ever going to learn about prophecy. Now, how then does God, and I think most of the codes, the idea of the codes, makes a travesty of prophecy. Now, the natural question you're going to ask me is, well, then why does God, or how does God, rather, foretell the future then? Well, that's not hard for God. God has this giant computer, and He can calculate probabilities to a degree that you and I could never calculate. And He, therefore, can calculate the probabilities, and then all He has to do to make His word come to pass is to tweak something here and tweak something there, or change one man's mind here, or cause one man to trip over a root in the forest there, and His word comes to pass. It's a piece of cake for Him. He can foretell the future because of the probabilities and because He can make it happen. And He can stop it from happening anytime He pleases. He can cut short a time. He can cut short a time of captivity. He can cut short a time of punishment. He can cut short a time of well-being, depending upon what we do and how we respond to Him. Now, what then is going on with this code thing? What's the motive? What are people developing them for? What do they hope to use them for? Well, now, Satinover makes the point that the codes cannot be used to foretell the future. Interesting thought, right? He would say to the Israeli intelligence, forget it. And the reason he says that is because you can only see the codes in hindsight. You can't see them looking forward. You can only see them looking back. Well, now, hey, folks, hindsight's always great, right? We got sayings about that in our language. Hindsight's 20/20. So tell me what is the value? Israeli intelligence made it, and the Scud missiles were wasting their time. Think about it. It's all written down in the code, in the Torah, and we find a date and a time and a place. And we send our airplanes over there and we destroy them, and we destroy them. We destroy the Torah. For we make it wrong. So that's an exercise in futility. Now, if this is the case, then what is the point of the codes then? Is it to prove God to a doubting world? Oh, folks, do you think dragging out Bible codes is going to prove anything to skeptics? I don't think so. Every indication as they've come out, people look at them and yawn and just say, oh, well, manipulated data. And they'll find some excuse for dismissing the codes. Is it to establish the authority of the Bible? No. In fact, which of you needed the codes to believe in the authority of the Bible? Anybody here? Did you really need the codes to believe in it? No. We all came to a full conviction of the authority of the Bible from the Bible. We didn't, and from faith and from belief. There's a way in which each of us came to our belief, and we expressed that faith and that confidence in God, and we believed Him, and we believed the testimony of the people who wrote in the Bible. We don't need codes for that. Neither do the Jews, because they believe in the authority of the Bible. They believe in the authority of the Tanakh. They have no question about the authority of the Holy Scriptures, right? They don't need the codes either for that. Well, what are they for? Are they for, perhaps, to establish the authority of one form of Judaism over others? Are they to establish the authority of one textual tradition over other textual traditions? For indeed, there was no problem with textual traditions until the Dead Sea Scrolls showed up. And now there is a problem. And that problem has appeared in the last 40 years. As Charles Worth said, everything we knew, didn't even say we thought we knew, he just said we knew, about Judaism in the first century, 40 years ago, turned out to be wrong. What they now know about first century Judaism, that it was an absolute ferment of thought, belief, practice, and customs. There was a whole continuum and range of things that people believed and practiced. There were all kinds of people. The people down at Qumran considered the entire priesthood, from the high priesthood all the way through the Levites, to be absolutely, totally corrupt and would have nothing to do with them. They called them the wicked priests. They had all sorts of epithets they applied to the priesthood at the temple in Jerusalem. And so it was that you had the Essenes, who lived in the outer quarters of most of the cities at that time and did not really interact with the citizens that were in town at the time. They were a different sect of Judaism. We know a little bit about them. But within the Pharisees there were sects. Within the Sadducees there were sects. Within the Essenes there were sects. There was a whole range. You go to the Qumran community, which is virtually a monastery of people, a Jewish monastery, and throughout the Essenes you have a whole range of what people will do. I was interested in all the wedding ceremonies. You have to understand, the Qumran community didn't allow marriage at all. They didn't have a wedding ceremony in that group. So Judaism in the first century was a real mosaic of people and customs and of things that they did. Rabbinic Judaism, which is the Judaism most of us look at today, is really the heir of the Pharisaic tradition of Judaism of the first century. That's the one that by and large survived, triumphed, and made its way down into the modern world. It is the tradition with which Jesus of Nazareth found himself perpetually in conflict. The others did not really make it. The other sects of Judaism, by and large, went by the boards. There are pockets of Judaism here and there around the world, even now, I think, that may differ somewhat from what we know as Judaism, but by and large, they perished, except for that segment of Judaism which scholars are now starting to claim and think probably that most of Jesus' converts came not from the mainline Jewish community at the time, or what we think of as mainline, that is the Pharisaic community, but came from the Essene community and others. And those passed over into the Nazarene movement and into one version or other of what you and I would call Jewish Christianity of the first century, which would differ from Messianic Judaism today, which is an entirely different phenomenon from the Nazarene movement of the first century. The Bible codes appears to me to be an attempt not to establish the authority of Scripture, but to establish the text favored by one branch of Judaism over texts that had originally been used by others. It was also to lend credence to a particular line of rabbinical studies and of rabbis and Jewish sages whose names are all found, almost to a man. Those names are all found in the Bible codes. Now, to an impartial observer, this is pretty transparent, what is beginning to take place here, especially when you consider any possible uses or meanings that could develop out of the Bible codes. To whom are they of use? To a particular narrow line of Jewish succession, as opposed to others that might have existed in that century. Now, there's one other reason. The claim is made that embedded in the written law, in the Torah, are all of codes that point to and give indicators of the oral law. Do you see the significance of that? The idea is to give authority to the oral law on a level with the written law. And this was a major conflict between the Jews of Jesus' day as to whether the oral law had authority right along with the written law, whether the authority was at that level or not. The Sadducees said no. The Pharisees said yes. And I expect there were more variations than you and I know about today. We pick it up from some writings that look back to the time, but our sources are limited and we don't know nearly enough. We are finding out more, and what we are finding out is becoming very disturbing, not only to Catholics, but also to Jews. We are finding very much so that there is very good reason to believe that Christianity in its early years, that Jewish Christians in their early years would have been viewed as a Jewish sect, in that they kept the Sabbath, the holy days, and so forth. Very disturbing to Protestant and Catholic Christianity. But we are not finding there the authority and the backing for rabbinical Judaism that people might have hoped to have found. And as a result of that confusion that's begun to arise, one has to wonder, one at least finds a motive. You know, we need motive, we need opportunity, and all these kind of things to convict somebody. One at least finds a motive for why someone might play games with codes and so forth in the Old Testament, especially when it is very evident scientifically, textually, and otherwise, and also theologically, that it doesn't make any sense. One then has to look for other motives that might account for them. Finally, the idea of a dictated Torah negates one of the most important ideas in the Bible. And I don't know if you have given this much thought, but I propose that you do. One of the most dramatic and most important ideas that you will find in the Bible is the idea of witnesses who give us their testimony. I believe in the testimony of the four Gospels. The reason I believe in the testimony of the four Gospels is because, you know, in the Bible it says in the mouth of two or three witnesses, every word shall be established. Why do you suppose Jesus did not write his own Gospel? Why did he rely on these men? Why did he let them go out and write these accounts, which tend in some cases to conflict with one another? I mean, it's a fact. Now, you don't understand this, that there's one gospel that will list three events as A, B, and C, and the next gospel will come along with the same set of events and list them A, C, and D in different order. Which one is right? Is one of them wrong? Is one of them an error? What's the reason for this mistake? Well, I'm going to tell you something that's going to, again, remember that fuse is burning that I lit a while ago. It's going to disturb some of your complacency on some things. It was not God's intent to leave us one witness of Jesus' resurrection. He wanted 12. It was not God's intent to leave us just the normal 2 or 3. He wanted 12. And of all the witnesses that there were at the time, we got 3 eyeball witnesses and 1 competent historian who has put this story together. If every one of these 4 gospel accounts was exactly the same in every word and every account, and that there was absolutely no distinction between them, dictated by God, what would you conclude? And how would you come to it? One author. One author. One witness. Why didn't Jesus write his own book then? Because he said, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. He didn't mean that he'd be lying. What he meant was it cannot be perceived to be true. Okay? So he couldn't write his own gospel. The gospel had to be written by witnesses. Now, I have read those accounts. They're like depositions of 4 different people who saw all these things. And yeah, I find distinctions between them. Yeah, I find variances between them. Yeah, I find what you might even call contradictions. You know what those mean to me? Those are the bona fides of the independence of these 4 accounts. And I know, based upon the work of scholarship down through the generations, that I have a true and accurate account. Not necessarily in its details. I have a true account of the work, the ministry, the message, and more important, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I believe that testimony. Not only that, because of that testimony, I have a very good record of the testimony of Jesus himself. And I believe that testimony. And because I believe the testimony of Jesus, I believe the testimony of Moses. And I believe, because I believe the testimony of Jesus, I believe the testimony of Isaiah and Elijah and other men of God down through history who have written of their encounters with God. I don't have to believe that God dictated every word of the Torah to Moses, but I do believe that God spoke to Moses. I have Moses' testimony You see, if I have to back off to a position that God dictated every letter of the Torah, Moses doesn't even matter anymore. Moses is not important. That whole parable where the man says, "Oh, send Lazarus to talk to my brothers. Tell them so they don't come to this terrible place." He says, "Let you have Moses. Let them hear him." Not God. Moses. Listen to Moses' testimony. The idea of the Bible codes negates Moses' independent testimony of God. And I think that is very important. And in fact, so do most Jews as in the same way. I believe in all of these things. I believe that in the testimony of Moses. Well then, what about Rabbinic Judaism? How are we to look at Rabbinic Judaism as it's come on down to us today? Well, Rabbinic Judaism does not apprehend God. It does not comprehend God. It is not adequate as an expression of God. It is a very small container compared to what there is of God to be contained and held and transmitted along to another generation that might come around. And Rabbinic Judaism does not come from God. It comes from man. It arises from man. Now, don't mistake me at all here. It is very easy to make a mistake at this point and become anti-Semitic, and I am absolutely opposed to anti-Semitism in all of its forms. I have the greatest respect for the Jewish people and their culture and their tradition and their language and their religion. I respect their religion as an expression of one people's devotion to God. And as such, it's worth studying. As such, it should be respected. But we should never forget that it is a cultural manifestation, not a divine revelation. There's a very distinct difference between the two of them. And there's another thing you should bear in mind. And this is something that we have not often thought about, but when I tell it to you, you'll know immediately that it's true. Roman Catholicism was not the only gateway by which the Babylonian mystery religions found their way among God's people. There was another gateway. It was the Jews. For among Judaism, you also find Babylonian mysteries. You also find the secrets, the mysteries, the Kabbalah, all of the secret things. And the truth is that in charging away from the Babylonian mystery religions of Christmas and all that kind of stuff, you can run the other direction and run right straight into the arms of the Babylonian mystery religions as they found expression in Judaism as well. Judaism was a sectarian religion, and there were sects of Judaism that were shot through with paganism, just like there were sects of Christianity that were shot through with paganism as well. And I submit to you that the only refuge there is from all this Babylonian paganism is the written Scriptures, not encoded as you find them before you, the translatable Scriptures, the Scriptures that can be understood in the English language. I was talking to a Messianic Jewish rabbi in Hartford, Connecticut a year and a half ago when I was up there at a Friends of the Sabbath conference. He was explaining to me some rather fascinating thing about Judaism and how in the process of understanding the Jewish culture, because I've made a remark about the Jewish culture as opposed to the faith of the Bible. He said, but you need to understand the culture, because in understanding the culture you understand this. And he ticked off this rather interesting illustration of it from the Jewish culture. And I listened to him, and then I said, well, it's very interesting, but I'd like you to know something. I came to precisely the same conclusion you came to from the English Bible. I did not know any of the things that he had told me about Judaism. I had come to precisely the same conclusion in reading just the English Bible, and maybe a little bit of Greek along the way, because I can study a little bit in the Greek language. So as I said, I have this tremendous respect. Yes, Jesus was a Jew. Yes, Jesus was a religious Jew. But what kind of religious Jew was he? The fact is that the religion of Jesus is fully described in the Greek New Testament. For in fact, the four gospel accounts, as far as we have any proof, we have a tradition, and Matthew was written in Hebrew and translated to Greek. But as far as any scientific evidence is concerned, we've got four gospel accounts, all written in Greek, all of which fully describe to salvation the religion of Jesus and what he did. And it is really astonishing how much you can come to understand of Jesus, of his salvation, about where he was going, and what he was trying to do It's all in your New Testament. So what about the Bible codes? That's what I started out to talk about. I think, personally, that the whole idea of the Bible codes falls. It falls because of textual evidence that says that there's no particular reason why you should use the codes in one text as opposed to another. And if you attempt to prove that this is the text you should use, by the results of it, you're going in circular reasoning in scientific terms, and you're not going the right way about the problem. That there is no particular value to the codes. There's no particular reason to trust in the codes to perhaps establish the authority of the Old Testament, for that's already established. There is no reason to use the codes to prove the existence of God, for that is already proved. You cannot use them for prophecy because you can really only find them once you look at them in history. What are they good for? They are good for establishing one line of Jewish tradition above the others and not a lot else.